Top 7 most influential game consoles in North America. That's right, I'm in the United States, and this list is heavily influenced by the console crash of 1983. Markets on other continents did not feel this crash to anywhere near the extent we did here, and as such, the gaming markets were totally different. It's hard to imagine this happening today because the console market now is doing fine and there's basically just Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo dominating the industry, but in the early 80s there were tons of half-baked game consoles and tons and tons and tons of half-baked third-party games from money-hungry Atari. In fact, that was their undoing. So with that in mind, let's have a look at my list of the most influential video game consoles in North America. Number 7. The Nintendo 64. Few nerds argue that Nintendo probably messed up by continuing to use cartridges on the 64 when discs were becoming much cooler. They held far more information and were cheaper to produce, but they were unable to provide battery backup for save games and less durable than hard plastic cartridges. Just the same, Nintendo went ahead with their cartridge-based system, and the games are now extremely collectible, and most of them still work. The 64 took a lot of our favorite franchises and brought them into the third dimension, most notably Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time. But that's not what was so influential about the console. If you ask me, the 64's biggest influence on gaming was the introduction of the analog thumbstick. Now, to be fair, this wasn't a brand new concept, but this was the first time we saw a major developer create a controller with a permanent full-time analog thumbstick. The weird M-shaped controller was a bit strange and probably a little too futuristic for its time, but I still think it's one of the most versatile controllers ever made, and it definitely set the precedent for an analog stick for superior control in 3D games. No major console since this one has been produced without a thumbstick on the controller. Number 6, the Super NES. My favorite game console, but not the most influential. In my opinion, the Super NES didn't really do a whole lot of new stuff. It just expanded on what Nintendo had already accomplished with the NES. But two things that it did add to the mix were an L and R button on the shoulders of their controllers that gave players unprecedented control over their game. The other contribution, other than an amazing lineup of RPGs, was the Super FX chip. This thing made 3D animation possible on a home system. By allocating resources inside the cartridge to render wireframe and polygonal graphics, we were able for the first time to see real-time 3D games. Frame rates were abysmal, and the amount of detail that was possible on this was lukewarm for sure, but it was a big step. And the Super FX chip signaled to other manufacturers of the time that 3D was real. It wasn't just the future of gaming, it was happening right now. Number 5, the Sega Genesis. Or the Mega Drive if you prefer. This console, and Sega in general, were much more popular outside the US, but they did have one extremely influential contribution in markets here. The marketing promised that Sega does what Nintendo don't, and that turned out to be absolutely true. Blast processing notwithstanding, Sega entrusted players with a new level of mature content. Mortal Kombat proved to be a point of contention between Sega fans and Nintendo fans. The Super NES port of Mortal Kombat took the blood out completely. Instead, characters secrete what I assume is sweat, but it could be spit or eyeball juice or something, I don't know. Sega saw this as a way to provide something they knew their audience wanted, but Nintendo wasn't willing to provide. With a simple code, Genesis players could get their blood fix while playing Mortal Kombat. Sales soared, Nintendo got scared. Ultimately, Nintendo retained their death grip on North American markets, but in Europe, the Genesis, or Mega Drive, had a much larger market share. Hard to imagine why, since Nintendo is clearly the superior system. Clearly. Number 4, Game Boy. This wasn't really the first handheld, and I feel pretty sure it wasn't the best, even for its time. But for over a decade, the Game Boy dominated the handheld market. With this little doodad, or this brick, Nintendo proved that it's not the graphical or technical capabilities that make a system or its games successful. It's the power of the gameplay itself. Games like Super Mario Land, The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, and of course Pokemon made this one of the longest lasting handhelds the market has ever seen. Pokemon in particular impacted the market. Besides the cartoon, toys, and trading card game, Pokemon also offered players a way to battle and trade Pokemon, and offered other crossover greatness. I would argue that this multi-platform approach to gaming paved the way for Yu-Gi-Oh!, Skylanders, Amiibos, and what other toy/video game crossover stuff you can think of. Number 3, PlayStation. Has Nintendo been dominating this list? Don't act surprised. Here in North America, Nintendo shaped the industry in the late 80s and early 90s. But in 1994, Sony entered the console market with their PlayStation, and everything changed. Now, if I'm not mistaken, both Nintendo and Sega passed up their opportunity to actually team up with Sony on the PlayStation project. I think the story goes like, Sony wanted into the industry, but only as a hardware manufacturer, and wanted some established game makers to handle some of the other stuff. I don't know, there's a lot of other channels that get a lot deeper into this. Gaming Historian is awesome, but it's not really my thing. My point is, Nintendo and Sega passed on what would have been an incredible deal to do their own thing instead. Nintendo made their cartridge-based N64, and Sega did whatever failed console they did. The Saturn, I guess? But because Nintendo was pretty hard on their third-party developers, it was much more expensive to develop and manufacture cartridge games than disc games. Several big third-party developers jumped ship to create games for the much easier and cheaper Sony PlayStation disc system. Squaresoft went on to continue their increasingly successful Final Fantasy series. Capcom brought Mega Man to the PlayStation, and Konami perfected the Metroidvania. Toss in groundbreaking games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, and just all kinds of games, and you've got the new champ in the console market. It's no secret, I'm a Nintendo fanboy from way back, but I've got to admit that they really screwed the pooch on this one. They handed the market over to Sony when they passed up on the Nintendo PlayStation deal. But if you look at the god-awful Zelda games that were released on the Philips CDI, it's no wonder Nintendo was shy about teaming up with a third party. Sega, on the other hand, just did dumb. They not good, them. Number 2, the Nintendo Entertainment System. What? Did you really think the NES would take the top spot? You're a sucker. No, look, the NES is number 2, and I'll tell you why. Sure, Nintendo revitalized the comatose console market in North America, and sure, they perfected what we think of as the modern D-pad controller, and yes, they rolled out some of the most memorable and iconic game franchises that we still play more than 30 years later. They did all that stuff, but you've got to ask why Nintendo did any of this. How did they know to be successful? Well, pretty much every move Nintendo made was influenced entirely by the rise and fall of our final and most influential console, the Atari 2600. That's right, the lifespan of this system inspired every move Nintendo made in the early 80s in North America. And make no mistake, if Nintendo hadn't studied and taken completely to heart all of the mistakes that Atari made first, Super Mario would not be a household name today. Atari let third-party developers crank out half-jacked games that barely resembled the intellectual properties they were supposed to represent. As Nintendo expanded, they made sure third-party developers couldn't do that. With Atari, quality control was almost non-existent, so Nintendo made sure to print their seal of quality on all their licensed games. And while Atari dominated, countless other companies flooded the market with their crappy consoles, and a few good ones. Nintendo did everything in their power to minimize opposition and keep other consoles away from their market. Yes, there was an NES in every household. It's ubiquitous among kids my age. We either all had one or played one, and we all loved it. But everything Nintendo did was influenced by Atari. Plus, Atari perfected the concept of cartridge games. Before them, home Pong consoles just had a few games built right in. Atari did awesome stuff, then made awesome mistakes, and ruined it. The repercussions of that are still affecting the market today, and that's why the Atari 2600 is my #1 most influential console in North America.